Okay. Welcome to ODSECS 39, and we're kicking off 2025 with Katlyn Carter, who will be talking to us today about Democracy in Darkness, her 2023 book that proves all too well Joe Roach's argument about the thick 18th century. I won't go into too much detail about the book, as Katlyn will do it far better than me, but I do want to say that this is one of the best books that I've read in years. It is rigorously researched, compellingly argued, and beautifully written. It is a real pleasure to read, and I urge you all to rush out and read it if you haven't already, because a year on, her book is even more urgent and compelling than it was when I read it this time last year. All this is a long way of saying that it is an absolute joy today to introduce Katlyn Marie Carter, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, where she teaches classes on colonial and revolutionary America, the Constitution, and history of the media. She writes about the origins of representative democracy in the 18th century, specializing in the American and French revolutions. In addition to Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy, and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions, which came out with Yale in 2023, as I've said, she has published in the Journal of the Early Republic and French History, and her public scholarship, which is really, really important, includes op-eds, numerous op-eds for journals as diverse, newspapers and journals as diverse as the Washington Post, Time, and the Age of Revolutions blog, for which she serves as an editor. She's currently completing a fellowship at the Davis Center for Historical Studies in Princeton to work on her next project, which we can ask her about in the Q&A after this talk. But before that, I'd like to hand the virtual floor over to Katlyn.
Hey, thank you so much, Elaine. Can you hear me okay? Everything's good? Great. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Elaine, so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for being here to talk a little bit about my book on this winter day. I'm excited to meet everybody and hear a little bit about what you are thinking about, what's on your minds. So what I thought I would do today is first give you just kind of a quick overview of my book. And then I want to briefly delve into part of the American case study. The book is about France and the early United States. Today I want to zoom in on a piece of the American case study. And then I want to wrap up by just talking a bit about some present day implications of my research. All right, so as many of you probably know, the masthead of the Washington Post today proclaims that democracy dies in darkness. But this common belief obscures the fact that democracy was actually born in darkness. When prominent men from across the newly independent American states descended on Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, no one knew exactly what they were doing here inside the Pennsylvania State House on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. The members of the Constitutional Convention consciously decided to keep the contents of their meeting secret as they hashed out a new political framework for the United States. One morning that summer, a delegate accidentally dropped his copy of notes outside the room. And when someone picked them up and handed them to George Washington, who was recognized, Washington apparently threw them down on a table back in the room and asked who could have been so careless with the convention's secrets as to drop them in the hallway. According to the deputy who wrote down this story, no one ever dared claim those papers as his own. They were so sort of ashamed and frightened by Washington's anger over this. Now, in my book, I ask why Washington was so concerned with maintaining secrecy and what this can tell us about how he and his colleagues understood the representative process. More importantly, I think, I ask what the effect of the framers having met behind closed doors to devise a constitution in the name of the people actually was. So almost all histories of the Constitutional Convention note that it was held behind closed doors, but none has fully recognized the significance of this fact. So in my book, I place procedural decisions like this one front and center to argue that we cannot understand how the framers or anyone else understood representative government without examining the way they practiced it in the convention and in subsequent legislative bodies. So, just to give you a brief overview, my book comes down to the mismatch between how rhetorically central transparency was to representative democracy and the prominent use of secrecy in its practical application. So it traces the origin of claims like the one found today on top of the Washington Post to uncover the way in which transparency came to be considered fundamental to representative democracy in the age of revolutions. But in my book, I show how in practice, this belief was really at odds with the reality that secrecy was essential to the establishment of representative governments in both the United States and France. So, by foregrounding political practice over discourse and ideology, I argue that despite the rhetorical emphasis on transparency, it was actually the use of secrecy that secured the legitimacy of newly created representative regimes. Commitments to transparency in the governments born of the French and American revolutions often resulted in losses of legitimacy and instability. So secrecy allowed for representative government to gain legitimacy as a democratic form by shielding much of the daily work of governance from the people ostensibly being represented. So the use of secrecy made it possible for elected representatives to take actions that did not always appear to align with public opinion, be the most popular, without losing their legitimacy as voices of the people. So ultimately, my book uncovers a paradox really at the heart of modern representative democracy, which is at its origin, its legitimacy and stability depended upon a degree of secrecy that was simultaneously being deemed anathema to the very type of government it was bolstering. So, my book, in doing this, really takes off from a recent revival of scholarship on the age of revolutions to offer a transatlantic history of political practice, placing the decisions deputies made about the place of transparency and secrecy in government and the debates they engendered front and center. So, it examines how founders like James Madison, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson answered a question we're still asking today. What does it mean to represent the people in government? And it further traces the thinking of French revolutionaries like Jean-Paul Marat, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, or Maximilien Robespierre about the proper relationship between the people and their representatives. And most importantly, the book takes up this task not only by examining what they wrote in a theoretical capacity, but by dissecting their daily decisions as they attempted to translate their ideas into actual practices. So in my book, I treat practices as constitutive of concepts, pushing the political and intellectual history of these revolutions beyond the traditional focus on discourse and ideology. And in doing so, I argue that representative democracy is not merely an idea, but a set of practices that accrue definitional power over time. So before I delve into the specific sort of case study from the early American Republic, I just want to give you a brief overview of how my argument unfolds over the course of my book as a whole. So my story starts in the mid 18th century when secrecy became a common concern in both Anglo and French contexts, linked to fears of conspiracy, corruption, and despotism. And I also want to note heavily gendered female, which I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A if there's interest in that. So just to give you a taste of this, you can see up here on your left a cartoon of British Prime Minister Lord North sitting astride a stream of corruption in Parliament. And on your right there, you can see my favorite image from all of my research for this book, or maybe all of my research writ large. It's a depiction of the discovery of King Louis XVI's hidden safe of papers in the wall of the palace during the Revolution, uncovering a skeleton in his closet with Mirabeau, one of the most famous deputies, with his head on it, holding some money there. This is a great image. So English writers and American colonists, they pointed to the mysterious machinations of the king's ministers as the root of otherwise inexplicable evils that they saw emanating from Parliament in the 1760s and 1770s. And you had both French and English reformers who referenced the tightly guarded governance of the Bourbon monarchy in France as characteristic of its despotic tendencies. So you had Enlightenment writers emphasizing the dispelling of darkness and the spread of knowledge as the social project of the age, and championing emotional authenticity as a cultural value. Now, accompanying this intense suspicion of secrecy were emergent calls for greater publicity in government, particularly in representative institutions. Now, publicity rather than transparency was the term deployed at the time to connote the opposite of secret. So it signified openness and accessibility, and to be considered representative, writers in England, Anglo America, and France began to suggest that government needed to be subject to public view. So the publicity and the representative nature of government start to become linked in the latter half of the 18th century. Now, at this point, I turn to the revolutionary moment of the creation of the United States and the outbreak of revolution in France to explain how determining the balance of secrecy and transparency in new governments became central to shaping the type of political representation that was practiced. So, moving back and forth across the Atlantic, I analyzed decisions about the use of secrecy in representative institutions to help draw distinctions about the way representative democracy was contested and also cemented in practice. So, decisions like the one made by the framers to meet in secret while drafting the American Constitution are focal points of my analysis through the book. Now, when compared with the decision of the French Estates General in 1789 to meet with open doors and an audience, the significance of these practices becomes all the more apparent. Now, these comparisons are highlighted well with contrasting images that I've put up here, just like these. And they allow me to draw distinctions about the way representative democracy was conceived of and constructed. So throughout the book, I trace two primary types of political representation that are really linked to opposing attitudes about the propriety of secrecy in government. The first type is what I call insulated representation. It's illustrated very well by this depiction of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Now, under this theory, representatives were legitimate because they were elected, because they were chosen. Once they were in office, they were meant to determine the best interest of the people without having to reflect public opinion or face external pressure. This vision necessitated a certain degree of secrecy throughout the deliberative process, which was considered to have a positive value. And again, this vision is well reflected in images like this of the Constitutional Convention here, where it's a pretty small room, it's a limited number of people. We actually know that the curtains were more likely closed. They were than they are in this picture, really trying to kind of insulate the process. Now, the second vision is one that I call reflective representation, and this required publicity. Publicity was necessary in order to facilitate the reflection of public opinion throughout the political process, so even between elections. And this idea is kind of reflected or depicted well in this image of the Estates General, with you can see kind of large audiences up behind the pillars there watching. You can even see there's women on the floor of the chamber here. The deputies are not even necessarily separated from the public who are in the room, almost participating in the process of deliberation. So my analysis is driven forward by moments at which the government's use of secrecy became central to public debate about the nature of political representation. And I want to turn to one of these moments in early America now, just to give you a sense of how I reached my conclusions about the way in which secrecy was central to defining the meaning of representative democracy and to securing its legitimacy. All right, so I thought today, in the brief time that we have, I would just quickly highlight one of the moments I examine in the book, which is the Constitutional Convention in the United States, which met here in a hot and, at the time, pretty poorly lit room in Philadelphia over the summer of 1787. So when they convened here, the men quickly vowed to keep their deliberations strictly amongst themselves. Precedent was certainly one reason why. So, meeting in secret was not uncommon for a legislative or constituent body in the 18th century. Both the Continental and Confederation Congresses in early America worked behind closed doors. Only four of the state constitutions at the time contained requirements to either publish legislative journals or to keep open doors during meetings. And even the House of Commons in England had only recently, at that time, and very begrudgingly, begun allowing reporters to publish accounts of its proceedings. So they're not totally out of line with general practice at the time. But attitudes about public access were changing. There were two provisions that would be included in the Constitution that would address the public reporting of government activity. One requiring periodic publication of congressional journals, and the other the publication of accounts for the government. So this suggests a sense among those in the room that some degree of publicity would be necessary in the government that they were establishing. But even in adding those requirements for certain elements of transparency, the framers slipped in a caveat allowing for secrecy at Congress's discretion, which you can see up here, which I've printed from Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. So, despite a seeming awareness of changing attitudes about the propriety of officials meeting and working in secret, the deputies in Philadelphia unanimously decided to close the doors and to establish a pretty broad provision here allowing for congressional secrecy in the framework that they actually produced. Now, critics of the Constitution seized upon the secrecy surrounding the convention as a central critique during the ratification debates. Many anti Federalists, as opponents of the Constitution were called, considered secrecy to be illegitimate in a representative republic because of how they defined political representation as a mirror or a microcosm of society, that conception that I referred to as reflective representation. So anti-federalists really rejected secrecy. They believed that reflective representation required publicity, which would allow oversight and facilitate the reflection of public opinion in political decision making. So they advocated for frequent returns of elected officials home, more numerous legislatures, shorter terms, and smaller districts. Anti-federalists tended to agree that representatives should be bound by the people's will, and they believed that this vision they had needed to be guaranteed by mechanisms that actually facilitated that in practice. Their rejection of secrecy was a significant component of this vision they had. And it's possible to trace this line of thinking through their attacks on the secrecy used in the Constitutional Convention, which were typically paired with assertions that that body had not been representative, did not speak for the people, because it hindered the proper relationship between the delegates and the people in whose name they wrote. So not only would having access to the deliberative process have informed public opinion, as many argued, it would have facilitated an active public participation in the crafting of the product, in the writing of the Constitution. So in the spring of 1788, a few months after the Constitution was released for public consideration, someone calling himself a plebeian pointed out in a pamphlet that because the convention's debates remained, quote, an impenetrable secret, he said no opportunity was given for well-informed men to offer their sentiments upon the subject. So now that the Constitution had been published, a free discussion, he believed, had brought to light its defects as well as its strengths. And the author used this to advocate that another convention should now be called based on this more open conversation. Now, the Constitution was presented as an all or nothing prospect. So amendments were not to be considered as part of the ratification process. But many argued that deliberations on behalf of the people to produce a document in their name, a framework of government in their name, required their input. And this input could not be obtained when the process of deliberation was concealed and only a finished product was then produced for the people's sort of affirmation or rejection. Now, Federalists, or advocates of the Constitution, they defended secrecy's utility in the framing. And even though they did this, you still had most of the state ratifying conventions that formally meet to consider it. Almost all of them meet with open doors. So there really is this sense that they need to kind of let people in. So as the people, or more accurately, their representatives, um, meet in these conventions in the states to consider granting their assent, The provisions for secrecy in the Constitution itself alarmed some of those delegates who worried that a repeat of the convention's procedures would be authorized in the new government. So Patrick Henry, who is a twice former governor of Virginia, he's the person who said, give me liberty or give me death, this kind of fiery political figure during the Revolution. He's particularly worried about this in the Virginia Convention. And he says, I appeal to this convention if it would not be better for America to take off the veil of secrecy. Over the course of the convention, Henry asserted that the people's liberties would be in danger if the, quote, transactions of their rulers were concealed from them. To shield the common routine of business from the public eye was nothing short of an abomination. He said it would lead to the perpetration of wicked and pernicious schemes and iniquitous plots. And it was not only the secrecy of the Constitutional Convention itself that concerned these anti-federalists like Henry, but the fear that the Constitution had not gone far enough in ensuring that representatives would work in public view in this new federal government they were creating. Now, citing the British House of Commons and American state legislatures, James Madison advanced the Federalist position in response to critics like Henry, replying that there was not a single government that did not allow for the discretionary concealment of its activity. So the Constitution was going further than any existing framework by requiring any publication of proceedings and accounts. And on top of this, he suggested that secrecy would not pose a problem in a representative government, noting, quote, there can be no real danger as long as the government is constructed on such principles, is representative, is a republic. Now, this very much resonated with the reasons he articulated earlier during the Constitutional Convention for why it met in secret. So, in a letter that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson back at the beginning of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Madison explained the reason that he saw for keeping the proceedings closed. So he said it was thought expedient in order to secure unbiased discussion within doors and to prevent misconceptions and misconstructions without, to establish some rules of caution which will for no short time restrain even a confidential communication of our proceedings. Now, here he's laying out an articulation of an ideal relationship between elected officials, delegates, and the public. Representatives, delegates could not perform their duty without the necessary insulation provided by secrecy. And we need to remember here that at the time, the case for secrecy is not just defensive here. Framers like Madison are making a positive case for it. Now, just to kind of highlight this point, I often ask my students this when I'm teaching about the Constitution or early America. If we imagine today that there was a constitutional convention held, and every aspect of every proposal and deliberation was televised on cable TV or debated on social media online, um, would that get very far, right? And usually my students just throw their hands up and say, no, I mean, we probably wouldn't get anything done. There's probably be a lot of doubt in the process as a result of special interests, right? Madison certainly thought this would have been the case even back in 1787 before we had these kind of technologies. Decades after the original convention, he noted that without secrecy, no framework would have been agreed upon. So, in other words, Madison thought that without secrecy of the process, there would be no constitution in the end. Now, I think it's worth pausing just to consider the extent to which Madison was right about the effect of the convention's deliberations being kept secret, both at the time and also long afterward. So, in the immediate aftermath of the convention, the fact that what had happened inside the room was not widely known did allow for malleability, I guess, to put it kindly, in addressing the intentions behind and implications of certain provisions in the document. So, there are a lot of examples of this, but maybe the most consequential was about the institution of slavery. Um, so, because it was not clear how the clauses related to it were crafted, you had both pro and anti slavery delegates who could return home and report that they had done what was possible given the constraints that they faced, and that the document either protected the institution or laid the foundation for its eventual elimination. Now, the secrecy of the deliberations allows for debates about the place of slavery in the American Constitution to continue even today, due to the limitations on the records that we have of actually knowing what the discussions were. But I want to quickly turn from the effects back briefly to the motivations behind this commitment to meeting in secret. So Madison came to the Constitutional Convention with concerns about what he and other delegates called an excess of democracy in state legislatures, where debt relief measures had frequently been passed and paper money issued in response to popular pressure. Now, here, it's important to note that for the framers, democracy, when they're using that term, really meant direct participation by the population in political decision making. So, this called to mind ancient Greece. It was considered dangerous, unstable, generally just impossible to implement in modern society in the 18th century. Now, for Madison, as for many others who were in Philadelphia that summer, democracy was not a solution to the problems they were facing. It was actually one of the problems that they were contending with. Now, whether Madison fundamentally distrusted democracy or not, it's unquestionable that he aimed to stabilize political representation as a durable form of Republican government. So, as he outlined in the Federalist 10, Madison explicitly stated that a republic could avoid the pitfalls of democracy by refining public views through representative institutions. He also argued that an extended or large republic could endure where others had failed by enlarging the political sphere to elicit the election of what he called fit characters who would have enough distance from popular pressure and factional interests to make sound decisions on behalf of the entire nation. Now, shielding the details of political deliberation from public view, along with increasing the number of electoral districts, the size of those electoral districts, that aligned with this vision of political representation. So, to put it kind of simply, you had Federalists who rejected publicity. They believed in insulated representation, which was actually aided by the use of secrecy in order to create that distance to allow representatives to deliberate without facing external pressure. Insulated representation meant that representatives were made legitimate at the moment of election. After that, they were meant to determine the best interests of the people without having to bend to external influence. And secrecy became another crucial way to create distance to allow legislative decision making without ongoing pressure from the unelected public. Now, Madison is a very interesting figure to follow here because just a few years after the convention, he appears to have changed his mind about secrecy, and some scholars have argued just about democracy um, more as a whole. So essentially, Madison shifted from this kind of federalist understanding of insulated representation to a more anti federalist vision of reflective representation. And his thinking about secrecy evolved accordingly. Throughout the 1790s, he would generally support the open doors of the House of Representatives. He would play an instrumental role in founding an opposition newspaper and publish essays advocating an active role for public opinion in what he called a free government. Now, we might ask what accounts for his changed mind here. The short answer is Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, whose proposed policies to create a national bank, take on federal debt, promote domestic manufacturing, and pursue commercial rapprochement with Great Britain led former anti federalists and some who had supported ratification, like Madison and Jefferson, to form a new alliance. While it was the policies that, initially alarmed them, their focus quickly became the process by which those policies were advanced, specifically the use of secrecy. Concerns about secrecy were actually central to these factional realignments that take place in the early republic and the formation of the first political parties in the United States. Now, I don't have time today to take this story forward into the 1790s, but my book does this, tracing these dynamics up through Jefferson's election as president in 1800. Okay, so I want to just wrap things up just by talking a little bit more about the broader framework of this and some of the implications for today. So if we place this American story in a broader Atlantic framework, It helps us see just how important these procedural decisions about the use of secrecy in government really were. While George Washington often noted the benefits of working behind the curtain, as he would put it, this was not a common sentiment across the Atlantic in France, particularly in the assembly convened in 1789 to advise the king on financial reform, the Estates General. When a deputy there suggested barring the public from their deliberations, he was met with downright disdain. I've included the whole quotation up here so you can take a look if you'd like. But essentially, one deputy said that as the people's proxies, they should work in a house of glass, that they should let the people into their very thoughts, right? This deep commitment to transparency. And this commitment to transparency tended to undermine the legitimacy of French representatives as voices of the people in cases where public opinion did not seem to align with the deputy's decisions, and these became increasingly common as the revolution wore on. So while the American government tended to open up more to the public as time went on, the French national assemblies trended in the opposite direction, sort of closing off more from public view as they go through the 1790s. But I just want to briefly return to those images that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the talk. The decisions made at the moment of founding in these two countries, these two kind of representative republics, had a lasting impact on the way representative democracy was defined and understood in these places. In navigating the tension between an Enlightenment imperative to eradicate secrets from the state, on the one hand, and a practical need to limit the extent of publicity in government, on the other hand, revolutionaries in the United States and France determined the character and durability of representative regimes. In both contexts, secrecy, in the sense of limiting the public's view of government work, was strategically deployed and defended to advance a vision of political representation as legitimated solely in the moment of election, rather than an ongoing reflection of public opinion. However, you had pushes for publicity in government that kept an alternate theory of political representation alive, contesting the legitimacy of newly created governments as voices of the people on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, though my book is partly a work of comparative history, it's not primarily aimed at explaining the divergent paths of the French and American revolutions. Instead, I aim to treat them together as contemporaries themselves often thought of them, in order to explain both the unique aspects of each and the emergence of what we now think of as representative democracy. And so, by using decisions and debates about secrecy and transparency in government as a lens to understand the invention and the evolution of representative democracy, my book explains how transparency became a cornerstone of modern democracies and the way in which state secrecy was deemed dangerous. And these are connotations we live with today. They're a direct result of a transformation in thinking that took place in the latter half of the 18th century. And the question of what can legitimately be kept secret in government, in democratic government, remains at the heart of contests over the meaning and practice of representative politics to this day. And I just gathered kind of a couple of many recent examples of how this question keeps coming out. I mean, questions about classified files being kept by presidents or found in their homes, Hillary Clinton's emails back in 2016, and WikiLeaks' role and belief in exposing private correspondence of politicians, impeachment hearings during Donald Trump's first term and the question of how public those should be, and even questions about the US Supreme Court and how public that process should be, especially after the Dobbs decision was leaked before it was issued. So lots of instances where this comes up, and they always kind of go to the heart of what we want out of representative government, how we think it should work. And as these debates sort of intensify, political scientists consistently tie the question back to the meaning of democracy itself. Now, as a work of history, my research is not aimed at producing a policy prescription or settling the question of whether secrecy promotes or diminishes democracy. Instead, I just want to explain how, why, and with what effect the question of state secrecy was linked to the meaning of representative democracy in the first place. Attitudes about state secrecy and transparency, like understandings of representative democracy, are not ahistorical. They've been shaped in different contexts over time. And in the modern world, we largely still live within the discursive and even institutional frameworks established in the 18th century, which I think should prompt a thorough investigation of their construction. Understanding the way in which debates over secrecy and transparency played out at the founding of modern representative democracy is really essential to clarifying their stakes today. Thank you so much. I really look forward to your questions and hearing what's on everyone's mind, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Kat. And I just realized I forgot to ask if it's Katlyn or Caitlin.
It's
And
Caitlin, actually. I give my
I
parents
guessed
what I
wrong.
believe
I'm
for this,
very sorry.
so that's okay.
I went with a British A and I should have queried. So sorry. Correct
No
all of
problem.
that throughout. Let's see if I can post edit the text. Uh, let's all thank Caitlin for her illuminating talk, and I will open the floor for questions. Either use the raise hand function or type a question into the chat. There's much clapping in the chat at the moment.
Thank you.
So Julia says, really impressive paper, makes me want to read the book. And I really meant what I said. I uh, first came across Caitlyn's book when I was reading for the Gottschalk Prize at ASECS last year, and it was one of the best of the 40 new books that I read. It was one of the ones that stuck in my mind the most. It was and it's the one I keep coming back to as the year has gone on, and we've seen the relationship between secrecy, transparency, politics, and media play out in this last US election cycle in not so terribly exciting, well, exciting, but not terribly happy ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Elaine. Yeah, it's kind of sadly almost become even more relevant since I started working on it as a graduate student, a decade ago.
Misty, you have a hand up.
Yes. Oh, Caitlin, thank you. That was utterly fascinating. And I'm left with this question that is colored by this, I think, present set of concerns in our moment. And that is, are there conversations about democracy and distance, right? In the configuration of representation, we also have the very real, sort of space-time continuum problems and communication technologies that aren't up to that. And I'm thinking about the images of letters, which were just great in some of these images, and thinking about all of the other letters I've seen in prints at the Walpole and elsewhere. And, is there a conversation about distance and communication technology? And I guess speed is underneath that. So it's a shaggy question. Thank you.
No, that's such a great question. There's a lot of discussion about that. And part of the reason that people, buy into representative government and the need for it is this problem of distance and size. I mean, they often talk about it as kind of size, but it is that point of, well, we're too, like Tom Paine talks about, well, the ideal would be if everyone could come and sit under a tree and we could just come to our decisions that way. Well, that's not possible. And so because that's not possible, we need to have representatives. And for people like Paine, who kind of subscribe to this more reflective vision of representation, they have to have representation simply as kind of a necessary evil because it's not possible to all get together. And so then their challenge becomes, well, how do we make it um, as reflective as possible? How do we try to overcome those challenges of distance and space and time? And there's a lot of concern about that. How can we improve communication technologies, improve infrastructure so that there's more back and forth, that news can travel faster? So you definitely have that kind of thought process. But then on the other hand, you do have people who believe that, representative government is actually an improvement upon direct democracy, that it will actually produce better outcomes than if everyone could come meet under a tree. And for them, like Madison's idea of the extended republic, the distance is actually a good thing. That actually it provides that kind of insulation where they're not going to be facing angry mobs at their door all the time, or they're not going to have to go outside and see their constituents while they're walking home every day and answer for what they did, right? That actually gives them space to deliberate and not be facing this kind of external pressure. And for that kind of theory, the distance, the um, slowness, for lack of a better term, of communications is actually a positive thing. And there's also even kind of this prominent idea that reading something, like if you read the speeches of delegates, that leads to more reason than if you heard them in person, like that it's a cooling mechanism, right? That it goes through if you're reading it rather than actually witnessing it. So a lot of interesting debates about this. And of course, I mean, I also always ask my students, well, what do you think Madison would think, today if he saw the technology we had where, you can just watch things instantly, right? That distance and that space is collapsed in many ways because of our technology. Does his whole theory kind of break down, right? Because that distance and time doesn't really exist anymore just because of technology breaking it down. So I think you're right. Those are questions that are at the heart of it too. Like when you think about how transparency is actually put into practice, it's really different when you have like recording technology or the internet versus when you're writing letters that take weeks to, go back and forth.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much. And if you haven't considered it already, the conversation as a sort of public space where academics are contributing would just be an incredible venue. I've got a stake in public humanities 18th century work, and I'd love to hear your voice more. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thanks.
Susan Carlisle has a question. Susan, do you want to ask your question? She's having to, I will read your question out for you. So she starts with a well-deserved compliment, nicely structured and interesting talk. So excited to read the book. And then she goes on to say, I would love to hear about how women were involved in the development of and conversation around democracy, as I think I understood was mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, for that question. This is Women are one of the key groups that I kind of follow in the book to think about a lot of the implications of these debates for how politics works and kind of becomes legitimate. So as there's becomes a lot of suspicion of secrecy in the state in the 18th century, secrecy gets very linked with women. It gets kind of gendered female. It's very linked to ideas about feminine influence in court politics, or kind of like women being behind the scenes directing things, and it kind of becomes seen as a negative thing in that sense. So I kind of trace that, and that kind of fits into a lot of the scholarship and conversations about the emergence of republicanism as kind of this masculine thing and kind of a formal, I don't know, cutting women out of politics, or like eliminating a lot of their influence from earlier forms of politics. On the other hand, I do think a lot in the book about how the commitment to publicity or transparency, letting an audience into legislative debates, actually does provide a voice or a presence for women, even when they are formally disenfranchised in these systems, that women are often present. And this is true in France. It's also true in the early United States, that the audiences in these legislatures are often women. You do see a lot of politicians having concerns about this, saying, that's not really right. They shouldn't be there because they can applaud, or, they can kind of influence things and they shouldn't be able to do that. So there's a lot of questions about that. So on the one hand, you have this greater transparency in legislative deliberations, allowing for women to have a presence and exert some kind of influence in many cases, even though they don't have the right to vote. On the other hand, I kind of look in the book at how it's possible that them having that kind of informal presence or influence helps legitimize them being formally excluded from having a voice. So, in other words, they can listen, right? They can be there as kind of spectators, but they do not have a voice, right? They can't contribute. And so I kind of look at that dynamic in the book. So I think that these questions of secrecy and transparency, it kind of affects groups, disenfranchised groups like women, in complicated ways. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but thank you for raising that.
Secrecy, transparency, and also silence and the ability to contribute versus to be spoken to.
Mhm.
Uh, Christy, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or would you like me to read it out? Can't unmute. Okay, so Christy says, I'm wondering now about how the growth of political parties has influenced our ideas of who the representatives are supposed to be representing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is something that I confronted throughout the whole process of conceptualizing this project. It often tends to be that whichever party or group is out of power becomes very critical of secrecy, very much advocating greater transparency, because there's this kind of belief that if it was more transparent, things would go their way, right? Or that you would expose this kind of corruption of the process. And in some sense, you could see Madison kind of switching sides. He becomes a opposition party, right, out of power, and he sees secrecy as kind of being used to, he thinks, advance policies that are ultimately unpopular. And if it was more open, he thinks, well, those policies wouldn't stand. So there is this sense in which whichever kind of party is not in power or is in opposition tends to kind of push for more transparency. And so in that sense, you can think about this. This definitely has a strategic element to it. It's not always like an ideological commitment to something that certain groups hold. It has to do with the dynamic and the strategic decisions that they're making. Um, on the other hand, throughout the book, I see cases where politicians continue to adhere to these kind of ideas about what should be public and not, even when it is against their interests, actually. And it's those cases that I find really fascinating, because then I do think that it speaks to some deeper commitments about sort of how the government should actually function, rather than a decision that's being made kind of in the moment strategically for political purposes. So you see it both ways. But I do think it tends to, there tends to be sort of some underlying commitments that um, the politicians throughout the period tend to cling to, even when it goes against their interests, which is something I think we see in politics, even today. Like, often people are making strategic decisions or flip-flopping on things, ideas about procedures and stuff. But other times you do see that there's kind of a consistent commitment to certain ways of doing things based on an idea about how the government should work. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question. If anyone has a last query for Caitlin. I Misty's looking forward to reading the book. So I'd like to end by asking you about what you're working on now that you're at Princeton working on your new book. So tell us a little bit give us a teaser for what's coming next.
Thanks. Yeah, so actually I'm picking up on something Misty kind of was asking in her question. I'm actually really interested in the question of truth and accuracy. So once once there's this idea that politics is going to be public, there are all these challenges of like authenticating truth, or how do you get legislative deliberations to people and ensure that those are accurate. How do you promote kind of accountability and trust? So in my next project, I'm looking at those questions, how people at the time thought about trying to secure truth and accountability and accuracy in this new public sphere. So I'm looking at the development of stenography and legislative shorthand, reporting at like the Sedition Act, sedition acts across the Atlantic world, and sort of how thinking about the truth in relation to politics was evolving, and different ways that governments and people were experimenting with trying to secure the truth in this public sphere, and how that related to public opinion. So that's where I'm headed next.
I can't wait to see the fruits of that research. If there are last call for a last question. Okay. Please join me in thanking Katlyn for sharing her time and her book with us. It was wonderful. And then please do join us, the ODSECS Collective, next month in February, when, Freya, do you have our next talk title in front of you? I've just lost that page.
I don't have it in front of me.
Me neither.
I can find it.
I'll see if I can find it first. No.
Like a tiny race.
Can't find it. But we have a very exciting talk coming in February. I think it's Sophie Valette, if my memory serves, which it rarely does these days. That do please check out the ODSECS website, which I'll throw into the chat now, and register for our talks, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and catch up on previous talks. And I will hopefully see many of you again in February, if not elsewhere before then. Thank you again, Katlyn. Thank you all for giving your time, and I'll see you all next month.
Thank you all so much.
Just